Hello, and welcome to Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub. We believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Jennifer Maritza Macaulay, author of Neon Steel.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. So, Jennifer, you remember when the Biden administration signed a law saying TikTok would be banned in the US unless its parent company, ByteDance, sold it to somebody that the US government liked, meaning not a Chinese company?
I do. And I also remember that TikTok did not sell itself by the law's deadline, which was January 19th, 2025. And it turned itself off in the US, and everyone lost their freaking minds.
Did that happen to you? Because I wasn't. I don't really do TikTok, so I did not lose my mind. But I remember it being a news story anyway.
It was a news story. I don't use TikTok either, but I remember everybody was freaking out about it. My students were freaking. It was just a lot. I do remember
And then
that.
the funny thing was, it only lasted for like a day. I did some research on this, and then because Trump was about to be elected, he was the president elect, and he was going to be sworn into office, and he sort of signaled that, okay, I'll extend the deadline, and then they
Mhm.
restarted. But then more recently, Trump got ByteDance to sell the American part of TikTok to a bunch of people, including Larry Ellison, co-founder of
Yeah.
Oracle.
Well, unlucky for us, that's not going to fix anything. Unlucky for TikTok, though, they're already facing a censorship investigation led by Gavin Newsom over claims that the app is suppressing content that's critical of Trump and ICE.
I wish I could say I was surprised.
Me too. But today we have a guest that knows a lot about what it means to live within and beyond the margins of state controlled censorship. We're joined by Yi-Ling Liu. Yi-Ling is a writer and editor covering Chinese society and technology. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, Wired, and The New Yorker. She was previously the China editor at Rest of World. She was a New American Fellow, a recipient of the Matthew Power Literary Reporting Award, and an Overseas Press Club Foundation Scholar. She is currently based in London as a journalist in residence at the Tarbell Center for AI Journalism. She's here today to discuss her new book, The Wall Dancers: Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. Welcome to the show, Yi-Ling.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
We're very glad to have you, and thanks for staying up late, I guess. What time is it in London right now?
I'm in New York actually,
Oh,
so
you're
I'm on
okay. Well, so
Victoria.
Oh,
not so
Yeah,
bad.
oh,
yeah,
very
not at
Um,
cool.
all.
the Biden administration's TikTok ban was born out of concerns for national security, supposedly, specifically the concern that sensitive data belonging to Americans would fall into the hands of the Chinese government. However, this is a two-way street, and we're seeing China express similar national security concerns over the import of NVIDIA chips, for instance, into the country. Um, do you see this There's a lot of back and forth between China and America right now on terms of tech and the internet. And is this going to escalate? Will this ever end? And what effect do you think this is going to have on regular citizens?
Yeah, I would say, this isn't the beginning of the escalation. I think tensions between the two countries have been present for the last decade, if not decades. Both are examples, at least on the state level, of how two countries are becoming more polarized, more siloed, more suspicious of each other. And unfortunately, when our leaders at the state level are deciding on certain policies and certain ways of perceiving each other and addressing each other, it does trickle into the rest of society and does affect the lives of everyday citizens. I've definitely seen, not just recently, but in the past 5 years, 10 years, headlines from both countries. Certainly, headlines in the United States about China will tend to focus on differences, divergences, instead of shared common ground. There's a lot of emphasis on the narrative of a tech race or an AI race between the US and China instead of possibilities for collaboration and dialogue. And I've certainly
What a
noticed on
concept,
both sides.
collaboration and dialogue. Why would we do something like that?
Yeah, yeah. And it's created this atmosphere of a lot of on both in both countries, mutual fear, suspicion, hostility. It's very hard if you're a Chinese national today to get a visa in the United States. It's very hard for an American person to work in China in the same way and to study in China in the same way as they did before. If you're caught in the middle, you probably find yourself squeezed on both sides. And I've found just like both societies treating the other as a kind of two-dimensional rhetorical mirror onto which to they project their own fears and envy and desires.
In the introduction of your book, you touch on how, in trying to combat China's techno authoritarianism, America's actually begun to emulate it. So, you say that America's TikTok ban, among other things, shows that the US internet has become, quote unquote, much like China's, not the other way around. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that, what led you and others to that conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think, when I was writing this book, I didn't realize the extent to which the internets of two countries, the US internet and the Chinese internet, would begin to converge in strange ways. The
Right.
book was very much about the romance of the Chinese internet as this force of liberalization, how that's waned. But it's clear to me that so has this kind of fantasy that we once harbored of a free and open World Wide Web.
Right.
Um, so, for example, one example that I like to give is just like the parallel trajectories of Weibo, which is China's largest microblogging site, and Twitter, now X. Back in the early 2010s, people called Weibo this kind of harbinger of free speech. And it was people were calling Truth to Power is going to be a town square for netizens to mobilize. I think
Right.
today, most recently, a Chinese intellectual called it this maggot infested pile of shit. Um, and, like it's very rigidly constrained and overrun by trolls and patriotic incels.
Mm.
Likewise, X or Twitter used to be called this like throbbing
Wait,
networked
did you say
intelligence.
patriotic incels? Do they have incels in China as
Oh,
well?
for sure. And
Okay, I wasn't
incels is
aware of that.
Everywhere.
Maybe
universal.
that was only an
They're
American thing.
And
they're
no, no, no.
everywhere.
Incels are universal and they're alive and well on X as well. And Twitter was going to be this like democratic platform that would bring information to all and topple regimes. And now its content moderation policies are shaped by, one of the most powerful men in the world. So I think that's a really distinct parallel that I've noticed. Another one is just like how close, closely linked the tech elite and political power are. I was surprised. I always knew that this was a dynamic in China, but I was surprised at the speed with which Silicon Valley's tech elite kind of align themselves to the rhetoric and policy directives of the current administration, particularly during last year's inauguration. Um, so yeah, there's this like centralization of power, especially around our most kind of sophisticated technologies. And no matter if we're in China or in the US, there's an attempt to kind of extract our attention for profit and ensnare us in these feeds and take over the kind of once open space of the web.
One of the things that is mysterious to me about, well, not mysterious. I you write a lot about the installation of the Great Firewall, right?
Mhm.
In around 1997, and you point out that like, which I didn't know, that like internet cafes, which were very important to some of the characters in your book, they were forced to install surveillance software right in their system. So you knew if you were going to internet cafe, you're being surveilled, right? I mean, America doesn't have that, but I also what I feel like the surveillance is coming from, or the control is coming from, the way that that platforms like X and now TikTok, which is going to be American owned, or Facebook, their algorithms, like how what they push and don't push, right? And there's no way to know. It's not as open, right? But I feel like there's still you sense that there's a kind of content moderation happening there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's really hard to tell, right? Because I think for a long time, the debate around TikTok was to what extent does ByteDance, the Chinese company that owns TikTok, like to what extent can it control what's on the feeds that show up, and for users? And it's hard to know, right? They could be twiddling with the algorithm and we wouldn't know. And I think the question behind that is to what extent does the relationship between ByteDance and the Chinese government then influence what shows up on user feeds? But now that TikTok has been sold from China or from ByteDance to US companies, the question still remains, right? It's been sold from ByteDance to a bunch of US companies. For example, Oracle um, owns a part of TikTok. But then the question is, to what extent does Oracle have power and influence in shaping what shows up on those feeds? And how closely linked is Oracle with the current political power and
Very.
administration? Right? Yeah. And so what, when we see kind of protest coverage getting taken down in Minneapolis, like it's very hard to know what exactly the reasons are. And we have every reason to be skeptical.
And Gaza has been another area where people have claimed that there's been suppression of images from Gaza on platforms like TikTok, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly, exactly. That's another point of contention.
One of the things I was circling back around to when I was reading your book was you said a bounded cyberspace does not mean a barren one. And I thought that was so fascinating. Could you kind of build on that and kind of explain what you meant there for our listeners?
Yeah, I think there's this assumption that because the Chinese internet exists behind a firewall, it's just barren and
Mm,
nothing grows. There is no
right.
innovation, there's no creativity, there's no culture and community. But that is, the furthest from the truth. Another metaphor that I like to use that I think better describes the Chinese internet is as a kind of walled garden.
Mm,
It's almost this like parallel online ecosystem, this alternate universe where a whole set of different plants and fauna grow and bear fruit, right? So
mm,
for every kind of US platform you can think of, there is some type of Chinese equivalent, though I don't want to use the word equivalent because often it's a completely different beast of its own.
yeah.
So, instead of Facebook, you have WeChat, and instead of Twitter, you have Weibo, and then you have RedNote, of which there is no US equivalent. People are using DeepSeek instead of ChatGPT. There are all kinds of ways of being, aesthetics, kind of user experiences that I associate with the Chinese internet and
Mm.
feel almost like viscerally distinct from the US one. So I think that's what I meant. It's more of a parallel online ecosystem than a place where nothing grows.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So your book orients itself around the stories of people who have learned to carve out identities and communities for themselves online despite the strict censorship in these walled gardens, as you've described. And you also call them the wall dancers, right, from the title of your book on the top of the Great Firewall. You highlight four of the people in the book, but there's tons of them, right, including yourself, who exist, have learned to navigate this system, and create change for themselves and others. What lessons can we Americans, in the face of less freedom on our internet, learn from these people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and something that I've been talking a lot about as I'm taking this book on tour in the United States. Something that has resonated with many people is this sense that Americans are going to have to learn how to be wall dancers too. And Americans are going to have to start asking themselves a lot of the same questions that the wall dancers and the subjects that I've been covering have been asking their whole lives. I think these questions can be both on the smallest of scales and largest of scales. I think at the very beginning, it starts with not taking for granted or not expecting that they live in an open and free online landscape. I think that's been the assumption for a very long time. And I think Americans need to start being cognizant and aware that these walls exist and that these systems of algorithmic control and surveillance are very much in place. Um, and I think it requires having a clear sense of what one's moral compass is and what red lines one is willing to cross and not willing to cross. So, for example, when a media company decides to lay off its talk show host in fear of political backlash, like what is the correct response to that? When the tech elite aligns their rhetoric to fit the policy of the current administration, what is the correct response to that? But I think at the level of the individual, there isn't like really one way to dance. I think it requires broadly for everyone to think more deeply about, what does it mean to think for yourself and carve your own kind of sources of information and spaces of information in an information landscape that is now completely warped by forces of algorithmic control. It requires thinking a lot about what does it mean to protect your private life from state surveillance and encouragement, and that could mean something as technical as like building up digital security and digital hygiene. And then for
Like
me, the
what?
most,
I need to like. What do you mean by
I mean,
like? What do you do?
yeah, to begin with, I'm surprised by the number of people who don't use Signal as a form of communication. I think
Oh,
like it's just starting to use Signal when
well,
you're
the
talking
Secretary
about
of Defense uses Signal, but that's a different thing.
that doesn't really help them. Yeah.
I've never even heard of Signal. I'm just out of it.
I would highly recommend downloading Signal and looking into it.
Okay.
And then I think the last and most important thing is just like, what does it mean to build community and nurture solidarity across borders, geographies, communities that wouldn't
Mm.
ordinarily be brought together? And that's already taking place, but certainly can do a lot more of it.
So, the wall dancers are all people who, despite the technological roadblocks, were able to build realities and safe spaces for themselves and for their communities and create change. So, one of the change makers is Lu Pin, who quits her job to become a freelance internet writer for women's issues and ends up becoming a renowned feminist activist. So, can you tell us more about her story and how the internet influenced her ability to create change?
Yeah. So Liu Pin is one of China's most influential feminist activists. Many young women know her as the godmother of China's feminists. She was born in the 70s, and her own kind of feminist awakening happened with her first job out of college. She was working as a state journalist at a women's newspaper, but it made her, on one hand, think very deeply about women's rights, but on the other hand, she felt kind of stifled by that environment because at the end of the day, it was this like party mouthpiece. And so she decided to quit. She decided to become a freelance writer, and she founded Feminist Voices, which at the time was a magazine, an online magazine that started as a kind of email thread but slowly became much more influential after she turned it into a social media account on Weibo, the platform that I was mentioning. It's kind of like China's corollary in many ways to Twitter. And Weibo was becoming really popular at the time. This was the early 2010s. A lot of people were calling Weibo this digital town square. And because Weibo became so popular, so did feminist voices. And it became this kind of hub for young feminist activists across the country who wouldn't have ordinarily met to come together. And many of them actually did, thanks to Weibo and thanks to feminist voices, find each other in cities like Beijing and Guangzhou and Shanghai, and actually allowed them to mobilized several successful campaigns on issues from sexual harassment to domestic violence to gender inequality in the workplace and at schools. And this all changed in 2015 after the government cracked down on a group of young feminist activists called the Feminist Five. And Lupine just happened to be in New York at the time and decided not to go out of fear of repercussions upon returning. And she was quite sad and disillusioned for a year or so, thinking that perhaps the movement was over, but in fact it didn't. It reemerged online and both domestically and in the diaspora, but this time through the Me Too movement that first started in the US, as you're all familiar with, but then also took root in China, except they called it Me Too, MITU, which is the um, spelling for rice bunny. It's like the Chinese internet users love using homonyms. And so in China, it's called the MITU movement, the Me Too movement. Um, and a lot of young women in China, both in the country and the diaspora, were pushing for increased awareness of sexual harassment and sexual assault through various online campaigns.
The first person we encounter in the book is Ma Baoli, a closeted gay cop who ends up creating and running the largest gay community in China. So his story seems to be one deeply rooted in using the internet to find and foster acceptance in a marginalized community, first starting with himself and then later to help others do the same. So could you read a passage from his story?
Yeah, and there was a particular passage that was pivotal in his life and I think emblematic of this particular dance that I describe in the book, where Mav Ali, the CEO of a gay dating app, or gay website at the time, meets one of the most powerful men in China's government, and they share a handshake. 10 days later, the Ministry of Health invited Ma to take part in a World AIDS Day conference. The organizers informed him that a high-level official would meet him, without mentioning who it would be. He walked onto the stage that day and found himself face to face with Li Keqiang. The newly tapped premier seemed thinner and shorter in person than when Ma had seen him on television. Greetings, Premier. I run a gay website, Ma said, starstruck, as Li walked over to greet him. Thank you for your hard work, comrade, Li replied as he shook his hand. That night, elated, Ma called his mother and told her to turn on the television, where the handshake was aired on the evening news. The handshake was acceptance from the highest levels of power. It proved to his mother that there was nothing wrong with her son and that his work was worthy of the respect of someone like the premier. Far from being ashamed, she could be proud. She asked for a photograph of the handshake, printed and framed. She hung it next to their dining table at home. The handshake, shared widely across the media, was a stamp of approval not only for Ma, but for queer people across the country. Nearly a decade later, when I spoke to a young man from Hebei named Jeremy, he told me there were two public events crucial to his excruciating decision to come out. The queer wedding staged by activists in Xianmen in 2009, and Ma's handshake with the premier in 2012. In 2009, he was a depressed and closeted 18-year-old migrant worker living alone out of a room on the outskirts of Beijing. He once visited a cruising spot in Dongnan Park, where he saw two elderly men having sex in the darkness, and felt such an intense sadness. I realized that I never wanted to end up living my life like that, spending my entire life in the closet, living a lie, he told me. The staged wedding and the staged handshake, the first an act of queer defiance, and the second of queer acceptance, showed him that he did not have to.
That's an
Amazing.
amazing story. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank
And I
you.
mean, I don't know if you mentioned this before, but he was a. Oh yeah, we mentioned he's a cop. I mean, he's a policeman, which is interesting. Um, I was curious. I mean, that's a good victory for him. But what is the status now of queer people in China? Is it still fairly open? What's the situation?
Yeah, I would say it's always been dynamic and changing, and it's never been totally open, and it's never been completely repressed. I will say, compared to 2019 when I first met Ma and when I was first covering Blued, his social media app, it's definitely gotten a lot worse. So, when I met him in 2019, Blued was the largest ski dating app, not just in China, in the world. He was working out of a two-story glass office in downtown Beijing with 800 employees. And
Oh,
there was a sense that um, the government was afraid of civil society organizing. They were afraid of any type of agitation with political rights. But Ma was able to successfully kind of build queer visibility within those constraints. He framed it more as a public health enterprise and a business as opposed to kind of any explicit agitation for political rights. Today, it's gotten a lot more worse. Ma is no longer the um, CEO of Blued. He stepped down in 2022. The company went private, and he is running his own separate business that has nothing to do with Blued. I think the rhetoric towards queer issues has shifted a lot in the sense that it's not just civil society organizing or political agitation that government is not about. I think they're emphasizing more of a patriarchal stance towards what it means to be a man. They are kind of scrubbing words like gay and homosexual and lesbian from the internet. Most recently, they decided to ban the word sissy boys. because it doesn't really align with kind of their ideal of a man being a fertile and productive member of the workforce. And so it's definitely gotten worse. That being said, I think cultural shifts are very hard to change, and the younger generation is certainly much more affirming, much more open, much more out than they ever have been. So even when political change is taking place at the top and making it really hard for people to be out, it's very hard to change, to put the genie back in the bottle or to put people back in their closets.
I'm asking that because we're seeing the same kind of, waxing and waning of acceptance. And, I thought that there would be this, when the Supreme Court decision Obergefell made gay marriage possible in America, and it seemed like the Republicans who had frequently run on against gay marriage, like sort of retreated and then gave up on the issue. But no, now in the last campaign, the Trump administration used anti-trans rhetoric and increasing attacks on queer communities as like a way of building popularity. So we actually have backslid on that a lot. It seems like in a similar way. I don't know why. I'm not going to ask you to answer this question. I don't really fully understand why authoritarian governments really don't like homosexuals. I don't. I wonder what the rationale is. That is that just an instinctive thing that authoritarians need others, and that's an easy other to make. That's the best thing that I can, unless you have a theory.
One possible theory is that authoritarian governments really take advantage of a kind of dangerous form of nostalgia and a desire to return and
Oh,
regress to the past, right? I think when the future is really scary and uncertain, people cling on to the past, and authoritarian governments tend to be conservative in that sense, and they feel much more comfortable and stable in old narratives as opposed to creating new ones. And there's something kind of threatening about a new family structure that they might not be familiar with that doesn't, play into the narrative of the trad wife that those who are in fear and kind of like trying to demonize the other are holding on to and clinging on to with their dear lives.
I was just teaching a Ralph Ellison essay that I love called "The Little Man at Chia Station," and he's pointing out how America and like art has been good because it doesn't cling to traditions. It breaks traditions and looks toward the
Mm,
new and looks toward the future and looks
mm.
toward innovation, which seems to be something that Americans are forgetting about. But it's something we should remember as much as possible. Speaking of cultural issues, right? Lupin and Malveoli uh, are also are some of the people that you profile. But you also talk about this rapper Cafe Who? Am I saying that the right way? Okay.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
and the tech mogul turned sci-fi writer Chen Qufan, and
Censorship. Yeah.
their stories seem entwined within this process of online cultural exchange. Both of them are deeply inspired by media from other countries and other cultures. And so to bring this full circle, you mentioned we talked about the American TikTok refugees. You talk about this in the beginning of your book, that brief shutdown when a lot of Americans came to use the Chinese social media platforms that resembles TikTok instead. And they were welcomed onto the platform, and people began swapping language lessons and all kinds of tips to avoid censorship. So, could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of cultural exchange that's allowed between countries by the internet and how wall dancers are able to do that even despite controls on their internet usage?
For sure. I would say for a lot of, or these two particular subjects that you brought up, Cafe Hu and Chen Xiaofan, and for many Chinese people who grew up in their generation, their worldviews, the culture they consumed, was very, very much shaped by influence and information coming from the outside world. They, especially if you grew up in the 1980s, this was a moment of opening and reform, where the leader at the time, Deng Xiaoping, was essentially like, let's open the door to foreign culture and let everything come in, from like KFC to Jean-Paul Sartre to like John Denver. It was just like the full buffet of Western culture. Let's like
John
welcome
Denver,
this in.
very dangerous thought
Yeah, yeah.
leader.
And obviously this is also paired with the arrival of the internet. So that's just like it being like sprayed with a hose of new information from the outside world. For someone like Cafe who you mentioned, he was a aspiring rapper from Sichuan province in Western China. and he fell in love with hip hop after he listened to Eminem's Stan for the first time online. And, it was very much through internet cafes that he discovered Jay-Z and fell in love with Jay-Z, and I fell in love with Eminem. And it wasn't just hip hop artists, right? It was like at the time Chinese listeners were essentially accessing the full buffet of foreign music, all in one go. So imagine like discovering Nirvana and Britney Spears and Jay-Z all at the same time. It was just like very overwhelming access. And it also, for Cafe Hu, um, kind of gave rise to this flourishing underground hip hop scene in China. The same can be said for Chen Xiufan, who is one of China's most prolific science fiction writers. He was also born and raised in a similar time, and just as kind of Reform and Opening and the internet gave Cafe the kind of gift of hip hop, it gave him the gift of science fiction. So he was reading Jules Verne's like Journey to the Center of the Earth for the first time. He was reading Arthur C. Clarke's classics, Isaac Asimov's books. He was watching Blade Runner and Star Wars. He fell in love with Stanley
So like Jules
Kubrick's
Verne was not available in China prior to
Jules.
like
Yeah, yeah. Jules Verne was probably available, but
okay.
like I think there's more of this like fascination with Western
Okay,
culture.
became more interested in it. I see. I
Yeah,
understand.
yeah. But films, for example, those were definitely not available.
Yeah, I wouldn't think
And
so.
yeah, so he like watched and one of his favorite films to this day was something he watched when he was 11 called and it was 2001 Space Odyssey. And he loved it so much that he named himself Stanley, his English name Stanley after Stanley Kubrick. So you can see that these foreign cultures like very, very much shaped the worldviews of both Cafe and Shin Fan. Um, but I think what's fascinating now is that after the kind of mid 2010s onwards, we see the culture going in the other direction, where Chinese cultures are actually being imported abroad, and um, people in the United States are also getting access to Chinese hip hop and Chinese science fiction. I think Chinese science fiction is probably one of the most obvious ones. The Three Body Problem was a Chinese science fiction novel that went global thanks to actually in part to Stanley Chen because he, as a young person, was connected to the science fiction translator Ken Liu, who offered to translate one of his short stories. And Chen said, "Oh, well, you should translate the novel of this writer called Bill Cixin." And that pairing ended up bringing the Three Body Problem to global readership and to Netflix.
One of the things is that in addition to the stories you tell in this book, you also identify yourself as a wall dancer. So, for you, what does it mean to be a wall dancer, and how has that impacted your life and the way you navigate the world, whether it be online or offline?
Yeah, well, part of the book is also my particular dance, which I think is rooted a lot in my own identity as
Mm.
a person born and raised in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is in many ways on the fault lines of two political systems, two cultural systems, two digital ecosystems. So I always felt like I had one foot in China, but also one foot in the United States, where I ended up going to college. And I think having kind of lived and grown up in both of these two places, I have always been able to adopt this perspective of both an insider and an outsider in both Chinese and
Mm.
American societies. So, on one hand, I tend to adopt a more empathetic perspective because they share this set of personal stakes. But on the other hand, I can have a more detached and critical view because I maybe don't share some of the blind spots that one might have when writing about a place you really belong and call home. And I see a lot of my dance as trying to be kind of like a bridge builder and connector between these two worlds, particularly at a moment when, as we talked about in the beginning of this conversation, the walls are going up, the borders are hardening, um, and we're seeing the other really is two dimensional. And so I see a lot of my dance as like facilitating that work of mutual understanding. That being said, it's become a lot more difficult. I too find myself squeezed on both sides. I too find myself kind of trying to operate in a climate of heightened fear and suspicion. And a lot of my work is just trying to push back against narratives that um, demand I am a pawn in some geopolitical game, and it requires like pushing back against narratives that treat the other as monolith and kind of demonize the other. And a lot of my work is just like, besides telling stories, as I was saying, just like building and nurturing communities of people who are also bridge builders and connectors in a similar way.
I love that you said you're a bridge builder. That's just amazing. So I love that. Love it.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank you so much for joining us, Yi-Ling. We encourage listeners to pick up Yi-Ling's new book, The Wall Dancers, at an independent bookstore near you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're so great.